Again, thank you for coming. This afternoon we're going to be talking about the cost of living crisis, and in particular, is the worst yet to come? And we've got an excellent panel here to discuss the various issues arising. But perhaps I could just say a few words before we start. I'm Mike Denham. I'm the chairman of the Taxpayers Alliance. And the inflation rate, as we all know, is currently running at around 10%, which is the highest rate we've had since the early 80s. So you have to be of a certain age to even remember this kind of inflation in the past. Now, where does it go to from here? Well, the Bank of England is forecasting a peak of 11% this month, after which they expect to see, and I hope you can all hear this, I can never understand why they play the Benny Hill theme. I mean, hasn't Benny Hill been cancelled? Obviously not. So the Bank of England are expecting the rate gradually to subside over what they describe as the medium term. But of course, the Bank of England's forecasting record on inflation is not at all good. And, you know, they have systematically under-forecasted the rate of inflation. So I'm going to ask the panel later on what they think about the outlook. And I know you should never forecast, especially about the future, but I'm going to ask them to give us their thoughts on that. But the second part of the discussion is, what should the government be doing about it? What more can they be doing? And we've all, I'm sure, read the same reports and had the same discussions. There are a whole great range of options they do have, potentially. They can carry out certain fiscal measures. They can perhaps subsidize certain products, and they're doing that with the energy price guarantee, obviously, at the moment. They could cut VAT, they could freeze duties, they could do things like that on the fiscal front. They could impose a sort of price freeze on something, which they did with the energy price cap. Those of us who are old enough can remember the disasters we got into back in the 1970s with prices and incomes policies. So that's perhaps not a particularly attractive way to go, but we'll see what the panel think about that. And finally, of course, the age-old remedy for inflation is tighter monetary conditions, which brings us back to the Bank of England. And there have been a lot of suggestions about the government looking again at the independence of the Bank of England, perhaps changing the mandate and possibly sacking the governor and maybe some other people around there. So that's another set of possibilities. But I'm not going to do any more talking. We're going to find out what the panel think. I'm going to ask them all to speak for around 5 minutes or so, and then we'll throw it open for questions and a discussion. So let me introduce the panel. From the left, the far left, we have
not usually a position.
We have the far left, Alex Moulton, well known to be on the far left. Alex is Director of Strategy at the Institute of Economic Affairs. Before joining the IEA, he's worked in a number of think tanks in and around Whitehall, and he also worked on the 2015 manifesto, and he was in the number 10 policy unit, and he was previously head of housing at Policy Exchange. On my immediate left, again, no political judgment implied, on my immediate left, Miriam Cates, who was elected as MP for Penistone and Stocksbridge at the 2019 general election. Prior to her parliamentary career, Miriam was the finance director of a technology consultancy, teacher and parish councillor. On my right here is Stephen Bush, who's a columnist and associate editor at the Financial Times. Stephen was previously the political editor of the New Statesman and has worked for Progress magazine and the Daily Telegraph. He was the first political commentator to predict Jeremy Corbyn's leadership victory in 2015. And on my far right is John O'Connell, who is the CEO of the Taxpayers Alliance and needs no further introduction. So we're going to start with Alex. Alex, what do you think?
So, I apologise for anyone else if I take any of your speaking points, because it's always the most difficult going last. But so, cost of living and sort of what the government is doing, I think, can be divided into 4 areas, and within that, 2 sub-areas. The first is the short and the medium term, and then there's the long term. And I just have to say about the Benny Hill, it must annoy them more than it does us. But there we go, because it must be incredibly loud. On the short term, then the 2 things you can do are higher interest rates and tax cuts and the energy package, or rather what the government has chosen to do. There was an alternative strategy set out and defeated in the leadership election, which was to try and keep cheap money and to try and not do tax cuts. That was the Rishi Sunak approach. It gave us the highest inflation in the G7, so it was a total disaster. It's amazing how many commentators love it, but we'll come on to why lots of commentators loved it. Part of it is because there is a problem that lots of commentators have very large mortgages. So there is a bias in this country against savers and a bias towards higher inflation than the public would actually want. So, for example, at the moment there's lots of scare stories about how terrible it is that people with mortgages, etc. There was nothing when annuities were going through the floor. There was nothing as inflation, which is a tax on all of us, which is very unpopular. There has been obviously commentary on that, but people are not prepared to accept that the only way to drive down inflation really is through higher interest rates. The public are prepared to accept that. By 4-1, the Bank of England surveys the public would choose higher interest rates over higher inflation. And some of our MPs need to stop listening to the London-based bubble and speak to ordinary people. People hate inflation. I think we have forgotten how much inflation, which is a tax on everyone, is disliked, creates uncertainty, creates instability, and is fundamentally a negative area. The 1992 election, I think, if the Tories are aiming to win the next election, a good analysis for them to try and follow is the 1992 election. So in the 1992 election, there was a recession, interest rates were raised, house prices crashed by 20%, not a record that you think could get re-election, but actually they were re-elected because inflation fell to about 3.5%. People were prepared to say, I accept that there has been difficult decisions, but inflation has come down, the economy has stabilised, and things are getting better. So essentially, the government has made the right decision in choosing an approach that is higher interest rates, and that has been alleviated with the energy and tax package. So there is definitely a problem with communication in the Truss administration. How many people will know that the average household, a household with 2 average earners, will be getting £800 by April in tax relief? They will be getting major support for their energy bills. That is not something that has come across. There is too much of a focus on, important though it is, the growth side, which is important, but there has been a failure to communicate that there is a support package for most households, and that the alternative to doing what she is doing is the Rishi Sunak approach of higher taxes on everyone, higher inflation, and lower interest rates, which is a fundamentally unpopular proposition with all of those outside of North London with large mortgages, let's be frank. And that part of the problem is that the commentariat and those who have large mortgages are very much up in arms, rather than MPs taking a more balanced view and looking at what the polls tell you, what most people tell you. So that's the short term. Her approach is tax cuts and relief for most people, the energy cap, the national insurance cut, the income tax cut, which was supported by about 3-1. The national insurance cut was supported again by about 3-1. So these are popular tax cuts. They've been totally badly communicated. The 45p rate totally overshadowed it. People will accept higher interest rates if it's explained that this has to be done to bring inflation down. So in the longer term, however, it's important that we have a supply-side approach. There has been a definite lack of realism about how quickly that can be achieved. The markets are spooked when you hear things, when you hear the Chancellor saying, this is definitely going to get growth up to 2.5% in the next couple of years. That does make people think that the approach is unrealistic, and that brings the entire plan into disrepute. I think that the areas where they have to focus on are areas where you can politically get stuff through. So, for example, in childcare, do we really need, the death of childminding is a good example. Do you really need everyone to have Ofsted qualifications? Do you really need to have some of the tightest ratios in Europe? Probably not. On the other hand, things like immigration are basically dead in the water. There is no point in the government trying to bring forward reforms that will be shot down by its own MPs. It will only create greater market instability. It will only create greater chaos. That's not to say, however, things like, we shouldn't celebrate things like the raising of the threshold for small businesses. So basically it's doubled. So if you are a medium-sized business, you are now exempt from lots of regulation, not all regulation, but the regulation cap for small businesses has doubled, and that is a positive thing for many medium-sized businesses up and down the country. Or nutrient neutrality, a bonkers policy that is basically stopping huge amounts of homes being built because of natural England and out-of-control Quango that Liz Truss has promised to remove. Focusing on some of those short-term wins, getting growth moving as far as you can, while being realistic to the markets rather than saying that everything's going to be fine in the next 12 months, which I think we all know is not entirely true and spooks investors and spooks those markets. And the final bit is spending restraint. By that, again, I don't mean unrealistic things. You can't say in a massive inflation-driven crisis, we are going to not increase benefits for people who are disabled or not working in line with inflation. It's going to have to go up. I'm pretty right-wing, pretty dry, pretty free market, don't like government spending. But you are not going to be able to turn around and say when food is going up by sort of 10% plus and energy prices going up by a huge amount, even with the cap, we will not increase benefits in line with inflation. And you're better off looking at things like the overseas aid. You could scrap the VAT cut. The VAT thing they did around overseas shopping, I thought a bit weird. You should cap the cap. There's no reason why if you... the amount of energy that you should be subsidised should be limited. So if there's no reason that Rishi Sunak, probably having a nice relaxing time, does not need support in heating his swimming pool if he decides. He should pay the market price for that. There should be a cap on how much you get per person on the energy price cap, and that would save a very large sum over the next 2 years. There are things you can do that are politically acceptable, and she needs to task her cabinet with finding those and avoid making statements that then get rowed back on, which again create market instability and again create chaos. So the overall sort of cost of living approach is, her core approach is right. Higher interest rates will drive down inflation. There will be tax cuts to help people in the meantime, and supply-side reforms, wherever possible, have to be pushed through. But this all has to be done in a politically realistic way and with a lot more sensitivity than has been done, because there's no point in saying things that just spook everyone and create instability. But the alternative, if Liz Truss falls, is not some kind of stable government where inflation drops to 0% and everything's fine. The alternative, if Liz Truss goes, is complete instability for 6 months, a recession, and then a general election where the Conservative Party is crushed. So, I think Kemi Badenoch got a massive round of applause for saying it, so I'm going to copy her because I worked for her campaign. She's great. Basically, people need to get behind the Prime Minister and accept and support this, criticise individual parts, but essentially the government's approach is the right one, and there is no alternative, in the words of a different female Prime Minister.
Okay, thanks, Alex. That's very clear, very punchy. Miriam.
Well, I'm going to take that as a glimmer of hope on a day that I think Conservatives need a glimmer of hope, so thank you. Is the worst yet to come? Well, I think it probably is, because when we look at the major contributors to cost of living increase, at the moment we've obviously got inflation, which hopefully we will turn a corner on. We've got interest rates for borrowers, which is most of us. That's going to increase the cost of living. But we've also got taxes, and taxes, as we know, are at a record high. And still, if we look at in our pay packets, the biggest cost to most individuals is the cost of the state. And this is a significant change, even within my lifetime. And I had a look at my pay slip a few months ago, and I went back to the 1990s and looked at the different tax threshold, the different tax rates, the ability to share tax allowances between married couples, and I worked out that my family would probably be about £10,000 a year better off, just under 1990s tax regime. So not rates even, just the different regime. So we are significantly paying more tax than we used to. That is a huge impact on the cost of living. And why? Well, the cost of the state has gone up enormously. I looked up in 1988, we spent 35% of our GDP, the state spent. In 2020, it was over 50%, 52%. So the cost of the state, the size of the state, has gone up enormously. And of course it has, because in 1947, when the welfare state was birthed, we lived very different lives. You might have left school at 14 and gone out to work. You might have retired at 60 and died at 65. There was no state-funded childcare, no state-funded social care. Communities did that themselves. Women didn't work. And the kind of healthcare that was provided on the NHS was basic. That just isn't the case now. And, it's not really an ideological point. It's just that our lives are very, very different. And we might spend 40 or even 50 years of our lives not working now. Whereas in, 50, 60 years ago, it might have been only 20. So the cost of the state is phenomenal. And even before recent events, even before lockdowns, even before the current financial situation that we find ourselves in, our Western standard of living, our Western economies, were not sustainable. And I think the OBR's forecast from 2018, so before any of this, said that by 2065, our debt to GDP ratio as a country would be about 300%, and that's the same for Western countries. We have a serious structural issue that is not going to go away. In fact, it's going to get worse because people live longer and because healthcare becomes ever more expensive. That's not a comment on the NHS, although I'm sure it could do with reform. It's a comment on the fact that discoveries are made, technologies become more expensive, and they become widely adopted. So we have a huge issue, and I think we have to grow. I mean, there just is there's no alternative. I mean, even the most austerity package you could think of would not get rid of that structural deficit. So we have to grow. But growth isn't enough. You cannot grow that kind of level. And I think we've got to not just look at the kind of economic supply side reforms, so better productivity, more investment, getting rid of red tape. important though those are, we have to reduce demands on the state. It just is no alternative. So what I think the government has to do is look at social supply-side reforms. So, for example, families are not able often at the moment to look after their own children or their own old people. Now, if they were able to do that, if communities could do that, that would save the state an enormous amount of money. And other countries do have schemes, tax breaks, shared tax allowances, that incentivize people to take care of their own children and old people. So, for example, we could reinstate household taxation like we used to have, like other countries do, so that people can share tax allowances, so that they can look after their own children and other people's children. We could deregulate that. And fulfill some of these functions that at the moment we expect the state 100% to provide. I think we need to look at the cost of family breakdown. We've got the worst family breakdown rate in the OECD. That costs the state billions and billions of pounds a year. My figure was £50 billion a year, but I've been told that's out of date and it's many, many more billions now. It has a huge impact on children's lives emotionally, but also economically, growing up, the kind of jobs they're likely to have and their outcomes, which affects our productivity. Family breakdown is also fueling the housing crisis. One of the biggest drivers of needing new housing is men in their middle age living alone because of family breakdown. And I think the number of people who are living alone, I looked at, was risen by a fifth in the last 20 years. So imagine the impact on demand for housing that causes. So I suppose the demand for the state is being driven by weakening social bonds and more things that used to be provided for by the community and the family being provided for by the state. And they might seem quite soft arguments, but there's a real hard economic edge to those arguments, which is the state just cannot fulfill the kind of demands that are being put on it. So I want to see economic growth. I think that's really important. But unless that is backed up with a social supply side reform, strengthening of our social institutions, our families and our communities, our economy is essentially unsustainable. Now, that sounds like a pretty hard message, but I do think as Conservatives we have an opportunity in this. And I was heartened by the Prime Minister during the leadership campaign. She did actually start to talk about household allowances and the importance of strengthening families. So let's see. It's a big reform to make, and like many of these things, it's initially expensive, and you have to wait years to see the dividends. But I think it's worth it because I just think there's no alternative. I would just say on housing as well. I think one of the problems I foresee in the future is for the Conservatives particularly, young people not being able to buy houses. It's not just a social problem, it's a political one too. If you don't have any capital, why would you be a capitalist? So this is one of the biggest reforms that we have to get through. I think we're going to need some pretty serious and pretty controversial planning reforms to make sure we've got the housing supply available. But I'll leave it there because there'll be plenty of questions.
Thank you very much, Miriam. Stephen.
Well, I guess I'm tempted to look at the question and say, I'm sure you have it in you. But seriously, the nightmare, of course, right? The nightmare of high inflation is it makes everything governments do less effective. It means that government spending goes less far. It means that household budgets go less far. It increases pressures on businesses, households, and states. The central problem of the UK economy throughout modern history has been a propensity to higher inflation. So, look, people can have their sectarian internal conservative fights as much as they want. I was about to say it's not my lookout, but then I remember that my fixed rate expires at the end of 2023, so it's a little bit my lookout. But, it's not really my lookout if people want to engage in excuse-making about how, if Rishi Sunak had done this differently, then we wouldn't have the highest inflation in what various groups they care to name. The UK economy has always been more exposed to, has always been more susceptible to inflationary pressure. There's always been the difficulty of the UK economy. But of course, the central problem at the moment is not that the energy companies have decided that they want to have a particularly nice Christmas party this year. It is because the invasion of Ukraine has decreased the supply of energy. And I think one of the real dangers in the political debate about the energy package is that I think all of the political parties seem to have forgotten that this is primarily a problem of us not having enough energy. It's good that we've got to a point where we're not going to have rationing driven by people's ability to pay. But I think there is a bit of a problem that the mechanism that the government has chosen means that people do not really have the ability to take that price signal and direct how they respond to it, but instead the price signal is being muted by government spending. It would be much better for states to use direct transfers through grants to businesses, direct subsidies to households, and while allowing the energy price to continue to do its thing. Because while in most instances you would simply be subsidising people going, okay, well, I'll use this to pay my energy bills, even if only a handful of businesses go, oh, brilliant, I can install a solar panel, I can install an onshore window, I can install a heat pump. Even if only a handful of businesses and households do that, you're better placed. I think there's a real risk that we have an energy package designed around the idea that, at some point in January 2023, someone will invent cold fusion, and the energy price increases will vanish into the ether. They won't. So governments can do things. One of which is that they can trust that markets work. I know that it's become a controversial opinion here to say that markets aren't stupid, aren't confused by bad comm strategies, and mostly do have the right idea about things. But markets do work, and one of the roles of the state is to make sure that the mechanism of markets is genuinely free and fair, but also that those rationing processes don't happen in an iniquitous way. But one of the things that we do also know is that it is important to grip inflation. It's always been a UK problem. But we do also know that ultimately it is incoherent to argue both for measures to cool demand and for tax cuts at the same time. It may be desirable to reduce taxes at points later down the line, but particularly the package of measures that you've gone for, I don't think is the right one at the right time. But yeah, it is going to get worse. I think it's been a real problem than we've gone for an energy price solution that goes against the market signal rather than works with it. And yeah, it's going to be a grim time for pretty much everyone in the UK and Europe.
Well, that's very cheery, Stephen. Thank you. John?
I probably won't be any more cheery than that. But and also, as Alex warned, there's some pretty good arguments that have already been used up, so I'll be as quick as I can so we can move to discussion. As Miriam said, one of the biggest costs of living is tax. You see it on your pay slip every single month, and alongside housing, it's the biggest cost that you have. So it's why the TPA have spent a lot of time campaigning over the years on certain taxes that might seem like not a big deal, quite small fry, doesn't bring in much money, all of these other kind of things. Thinking specifically of campaigns that we've run on beer duty, which disproportionately hits those on lower incomes. Parking levies, again, disproportionately hits those on lower incomes. Regulations like extended producer responsibility, which we call a wrapper tax, which will again hit those on lower incomes. Sugar tax, what does it do? Hits those on lower incomes. And proposals for things like a meat tax would do exactly the same thing. So, focusing on these smaller taxes is really important to hammer home the idea that the government imposes a big cost of living on people every single day, and separate from market pressures on inflation. And then, of course, we've looked at some of the bigger taxes, and most recently on bringing forward the income tax cut on the basic rate, which we were pleased to see most recently, and the cancellation of the national insurance increase, which again we felt was the wrong thing to do at this time. And it's not just individuals; it's businesses too, which is why a lot of our local campaigning outside of Westminster focuses on business rates. People talk about the death of the high street. It's hardly surprising when quite often businesses are paying higher rates than they are rents. And it seems to be quite an open goal for the government to look at business rates in the round, and in the short term to cut it quite substantially, and in the longer term look to replace it, because it's a messy tax that isn't fit for the future. So what do you do about all of that in the longer term? The big prize is tax reform, and it's not just about cutting taxes here and raising taxes there. It's actually about tax reform. If you're looking at the big picture, Miriam mentioned it on what she called the social supply side. But over the recent years, I remember Philip Hammond tried to increase national insurance for self-employed people, which fell apart in no time at all. A lot of this is because people at the Treasury are rightly concerned that the tax base is shrinking and shrinking. So, a lot of the taxes that I just named, they're brought in for these sort of benevolent reasons, for people to lose weight, to cut obesity, but they're also revenue streams because the government is terrified that the tax base is disappearing before their very feet. So tax reform in the longer term would not only, done in the right way, would not only help with economic growth and investment, but it would also future-proof the tax base. And in the immediate term, again, Miriam touched on this quite extensively. We have a cost of government crisis just as much as we have a cost of living crisis. We had an event earlier on apprenticeships, and we had Rob Halfon on, and he was talking about how, in his role at the Education Select Committee, Quangos come in to offer evidence to the committee, and he said most of them do not measure outcomes. They can tell you how much money they get. They can tell you that they held a conference for this and spent money on that, but most of them do not measure outcomes. And if we're not measuring outcomes for what the government does, then we can surely start to have a look quite seriously at the size and scope of the state and start to roll it back to areas where it's going to be most effective for delivering public services that matter most to those on lowest incomes. So, just to echo exactly what Miriam said, I think there's a cost of government crisis as much as there is a cost of living crisis. In fact, one feeds the other. So I'd be looking to do much more on rolling back areas of the state that don't deliver for those who are on the lowest incomes and those who are in need of public services. And I'll be looking at tax reform in the longer term to make sure that we've got a sustainable tax base that's able to pay for those public services.
Okay, thanks, John. Well, obviously we've got some differences of view on the panel, which is absolutely excellent. Just picking up this issue about tax cuts versus interest rate rises. I don't want to put words into Stephen's mouth, but he sounds, although he says he's not interested in discussing the sort of ins and outs of debates in the Conservative Party, he sounds a lot more sympathetic to the kind of line that Rishi Sunak was pursuing, whereas Alex, of course, is quite strongly opposed to it. Can I just get Alex to talk a little bit more and perhaps come back on some of what Stephen said? And, should we accept that there is quite an important trade-off here between tax cuts and higher interest rates?
There's always a trade-off. Like, one of the things that we've learned is there is no cake that you can have and eat it. And I think we learned the limits of that approach with a former Prime Minister. The core point is that 1 in 4 people have a mortgage. 75% of people do not. Many of those people have a mortgage of £50,000, £75,000, £100,000. The tax cuts that have been delivered and the energy package will outweigh the increase in mortgages for many of those people. The problem is that the people who that does not work for are usually in London in their 40s, who are commentators, people who work in banks, others, and they say, this cannot be afforded, this is terrible. They were not there when savers were left hanging out to dry. They were not there as inflation rocketed and interest rates were left behind for far too long. So there is a systemic bias basically towards a group of people who want, at all costs, low interest rates. Rishi Sunak was their champion, and they are quite prepared to crucify the rest of the country on high inflation, and that's the trade-off, and that is a wrong trade-off. MPs need to look at the polls, need to look at the figures, and need to look at the numbers of people who will benefit and lose from the different packages. The reason Liz Truss won is that more people hate inflation and think that they need support through tax cuts, and they are prepared to see interest rates to rise. One of the problems is the government has kind of sort of fudged it. It's ended up in the worst of all worlds, where people with higher mortgages are really angry at them, but they are not getting the point across, which is interest rates will have to go up. They are going up everywhere, and the alternative is to have sustained inflation running at close to 10%. If we do not squeeze inflation out of the system, the Conservative Party in 2 years' time will be wiped out of the general election. The public hate inflation. They really, really hate sustained inflation, and therefore there has to be an acceptance that there is no alternative other than higher interest rates. And the reason Liz Truss is doing tax cuts is to make sure that many people are getting some support with their mortgages and some support on the cost of living. I have to say, I do agree with Steve on some things. I thought cap the cap, it would be my... now that we've done it, let's at least say that you don't need... Rich people should not be getting unlimited support. That is mad. And at a time when that is not a price worth paying. I'm prepared to accept higher interest rates for tax cuts for people on average income taxpayers. I think it's mad that higher interest rates are not a price worth paying so that rich people can heat a 6-bedroom house if they decide to. That is not a price worth paying. But the core argument has to be, we will squeeze out inflation. That is the core of our plan, and we will do some tax cuts and supply-side reforms so that in the longer term, that some of that borrowing is sustainable, and so that households have a higher quality of living than they otherwise would.
Stephen, it's only fair that I give you a chance to come back on that.
Well, I think, look, it's important to be clear here that actually, even if you are borrowing only 100k, your mortgage is still going to go up if you have to refinance next year by more than you are getting annual tax cut, right? So it's not simply a problem of people who have big houses in North London or indeed small flats in North London. I mean, nor do I, as a North Londoner, want to crucify anyone. We tried that once, we North Londoners, it didn't take. But anyway, sorry, it's one of those code words that just sets off my look, but seriously, I think we've got to be realistic, right? I think Miriam's exactly right. There is a reason why state spending has since 2016 not gone down anymore. It's not because you've lost your passion, and if you just argue a bit stronger for some more cuts, you're going to be able to get electoral buy-in for it. Is broadly speaking, when the welfare state was founded, the number one killer was heart attacks, and now the number one killer is dementia, and that does mean a permanently higher set of obligations for the state in a democracy. You've just got to live with it. And ambition on tax cuts has got to be paired with ambition on spending cuts, and it also has to be paired with realism about what it is about what spending you could actually cut. Now, public sector reform is a great way to get states to run more efficiently, but there is no successful public sector reform, including the two implemented by the Conservatives in the last decade, which did not involve spending more in order to do that reform, because you have to, when you're reforming the state, essentially run two sets of bureaucracies at the same time, right? There was a period in which you were paying both to run universal credit and to run the legacy benefit system. So look, you can do all of these things. It's right to have ambition about reform, but it has to be coupled with a serious and clear-eyed position. I think it's right to have a focus on tax reform. I think that, look, if instead of doing the additional rate, you had got rid of that weird 60p rate for people earning 100 to 120, equalised CGT and dividends income, yes, the distributional analysis would still have benefited the rich, but it would have been much clearer why that would actually trigger growth, rather than a growth plan which has somehow managed to make our tax system even more complicated than it was at the beginning. So yes, there needs to be there needs to be realism about tax and spend.
I do have to quickly come back and say, if you're assuming reasonable energy calculations, given the Ukraine war does appear that it will drag on for some time, people with a £75,000 mortgage, with the energy price cap and the tax cuts, they will probably get more support than they would lose out from higher mortgages. So that I take your point that tax cuts alone, but the overall package means that the amount of people who are actually losing out is quite small. It is focused on a small group of highly indebted households, mostly in London and the South East. But I agree with almost everything else Stephen said. Like, there is a problem with the state. Miriam made it very effectively. There is a problem with quangos that John was right. Like, it is absurd that you have many institutions that spend billions of pounds of taxpayers' money that have no democratic oversight whatsoever and are often pursuing objectives that are nothing to do with what government or the public really want. So I'm very much in favour of reform in all those areas. And finally, I agree very much that the 62% weird kink rate that you get over 100,000 and the UC effective marginal tax rate is are much better areas. I think the market would have understood if you were said, we're getting rid of a 62% rate and we're trying to bring down UC so people can come, often when you have a second earner in a low-income household, it's not worth their while, particularly when they children go back to school. I know, so I don't want to get into a discussion about whether they should be working when they're very young with Miriam. But let's assume that their second child has gone back to school and they want to increase their hours. Often they will, people aren't stupid. People will look and say, why should I increase my hours? Like the effective marginal tax rate with national insurance, income tax, and the withdrawal of UC is such that it's just not worth it. And I think that had a package focused on marginal tax rates, it could have been understood more rather than did people really think there would be a massive incentive effect from 45 to 40. I probably think it wouldn't have cost the government much, but I think it was a harder message to communicate across than saying people have, interesting enough, I did polling on this in a previous think tank. People really understand that over 50% is a bad tax rate. People have a real understanding that there is a psychological barrier around 50%, that if you take out more than half of someone's money, they really hate it. So one of the problems with GPs is a lot of them earn just around the £100,000 weird 62% rate. And I have friends who are like, well, I locum because why wouldn't I? I don't want to pay 62%. Why should I work that extra fifth day when I can work 4 days and earn 95 grand? And so there was a real problem at that 100k threshold, and that could have been explained better. But I think the 45 pence was poorly thought through compared to some of the other marginal tax rates you've got in the system.
Okay, well, I am going to throw it open to questions in a minute, but Miriam, you wanted to add something.
Yes, just to pick up on a couple of Alex's points. I mean, I completely agree with you about the effective marginal tax rates for people at the bottom of the income spectrum. I mean, some people face 80% effective marginal tax rate. So if you're a single earner family on low income and parent 2 wants to go back to work a few hours, earn enough money to save up to buy a car, the effective marginal tax rate on that is 80%. You're never, ever, ever going to save up to buy a car. It completely disincentivizes people from rising up the income scale. Another disincentivizer is the cliff edge of the higher income tax rate. When that was introduced, 6% of income of earners paid that. It was meant to be for the super rich. It's now 20%. That's pretty much all middle-class houses. That's a huge cliff edge for people who don't accept promotions, because if you go into that bracket, not only are you penalised hugely from a tax point of view, especially if you have one non-earning or low-earning partner, you also start to lose your child benefit and all sorts of others. It's just not worth it. People will stay below that level, which is terrible for growth and productivity. So that would have been, I think, a better target for a tax cut or a tax change would be to raise that threshold. But just one more thing on the interest rates. I agree with Alex. I think the interest rates is a pain we have to endure, because for my whole adult life it has not been worth saving, because interest rates have been so low that even though we have had low inflation, it's still been higher than interest rates. People my age and below just don't save because there is no point, and that's why we're so exposed, is because we're so indebted. So we have to right that wrong, and there will be pain in the meantime for that, and I just don't think we can avoid that.
Okay, thanks, Miriam. One quick comment from John, and then we will have some questions.
Yeah, sorry, Mike, I'll be very quick. Stephen was talking about long-term healthcare into old age, and if you look at OBR forecasts, that is the big pressure on national debt out to 2066 and beyond. On some forecasts, it takes national debt above 200% of GDP. So I agree with Stephen that you actually need to refocus spending priorities onto that, but that's all the more reason to save to spend. That is all the more reason to do that, because there is a taxable capacity in the economy that we're probably either close to or near. So in order to spend money on those long-term priorities, is imperative to get a grip on spending now on the things that don't matter. That's why a review in the sort of immediate term will be important from the government, so that they show that they will be able to balance the books on that. So, sorry, Mike, I'll stop there.
Okay, all right, let's have some questions. Raise your hand if you'd like to ask a question. We've got some at the back there. Let's start at the back. Lady at the back there.
Hi, I'm Katie Schmucker from the Joseph Rowntree Foundation. Do the panel think that the worst will be yet to come for the lowest income people in our country if benefits are not uprated in the usual way come April?
Miriam, do you want to have a go at that?
Well, I hope benefits will be uprated, absolutely. But I think we also got to be aware that if benefits are uprated, public sector pay is uprated, etc., we're just fueling an inflation crisis. But I do think that the focus has to be on the lowest incomes, people on the lowest incomes who will feel the cost of living pressure the most. But again, I do think long-term what we need is taxation reform. I think we've taken too many people out of tax and then replaced and used benefits instead. And the marginal rates you get from that are really disincentivizing to work. I think it would be better to have a very low rate of tax, a 10% rate again, right at the bottom of the income spectrum, to take less money away from people in the first place, rather than having to give a lot back, which they then lose in quite high rates, even with the clawback from universal threshold having been lowered. So, yeah, I'd fully support the uprating of benefits. It's not going to solve the whole problem, but we've got to do it. It's the moral thing.
Okay. One at the front here.
Hi, hello. My name's Jamila. I'm from Mencat. Just looking at social care and public sector cuts. We just had a fringe event with was talking about how can we fix social care, and we've got social care providers saying they have made as many cuts as they possibly can. The more cuts you make, the cuts will start to go into the care workers' salaries, considering they're already low paid, don't have parity of esteem with NHS workers. It's going to have a knock-on effect onto the rest of society. This talk about social bonds weakening and that families need to take more care and be paid for that. I'd really welcome you to have a meeting with us, because we've got lots of families who are saying, actually, don't have a lot of support. And also, we are taking care of our families, but there's not enough respite, there's not enough funding into social care. It's about £6 billion underfunded. So I just wanted to see what the panel thought about social
Miriam,
care.
why don't you take that one as well?
Oh, okay. Yes, I think there are countries in the world, I think Germany, I can't remember the exact details, have incentivised people through the tax system to look after their own older people. And of course, it's much cheaper for the state and much better for the older people and the families. So I very much think we should have something like that. But I think we also need to be aware of the cost to young people of social care. I don't think it's fair that young people should pay huge taxes to look after people who are older now. I think we need some sort of personal insurance scheme rather than using general taxation. But it is the biggest problem we've got now in terms of the pressure on the NHS is not enough social care. So I don't really have a short-term answer to that. I wish I did, but yeah, I'm very happy to meet with you, although I don't have any power. Yeah, it's adult, yes, or yes, working age adults.
Another element to that is the fact that council budgets are, 60%, sometimes 70%, sometimes higher, of their budgets are made up of adult social care costs. So when we talk about, saving money on a national level, councils could do more to save in areas that aren't a priority in order to preserve their adult social care budgets, because it's putting more and more pressure on individual local authority budgets as much as it is a national question. There
is a reform. So one of the problems with social care is we haven't built, so I agree entirely with Miriam about supporting people who are within families. There is a problem that, and this is the kind of stuff that is really boring and difficult and no one cares about it, and policy wonks like me get very annoyed because this should be the kind of thing that whether you're left wing or right wing, it shouldn't matter. There is a problem in the structure of social care. Councils have control of it. Councils are worried about their budgets. Councils don't like building care homes. Care homes have not been built in any significant numbers in the past 25 years. Productivity in the social care system has collapsed by about 20 to 25%, which costs billions of pounds. So instead we end up having this dance of like, should we spend more, should we spend less? Regardless of how much you want to spend, it should be taken off councils. There should be a per person individual budget, and councils will be... When I spoke to council leaders when I used to work in number 10, they were like, I'm not going to permit any new social care units to be built in my area or retirement houses because I'm scared of what it will do to my long-term budget. So you end up with a weird cycle where nothing new is built. Other countries have retirement villages, they have newer care facilities that are basically more productive. The size of the average social care unit in the UK is too small. And it's one of those bits where, going back to the point about government is too big, politics focuses too much on the bits. I say this as someone who can be quite divisive, but sometimes we do focus too much on the stuff that divides us. This is a boring administrative reform that would cut the cost of the state and make better social care provision for everyone, but it kind of gets lost because, sadly, there are too many politicians and bits of the system that love basically having a ding-dong rather than going, what is a boring administrative reform that would mean that we would have a better social care funding system that changes the incentives so we got more social care homes built, which means that social care is more productive, which means that we get better social care that is cheaper. Anyway, sorry, that was a
Okay, another question. One at the back there. Oh, okay, well, we'll come to you later.
So my question is that governments often are said to cause negative things in their attempts to solve positive problems with positive intent, rather. So my question is then, how can governments make sure that they don't fuel inflation in their attempts to solve it?
Stephen, do you want to have a go at that?
Well, look, again, this is why inflation is really difficult. It makes everything harder. It's why, it's why I don't think that that we should treat the particular way that the UK has approached central bank independence as sort of the only way you can do confirmation hearings, the only way you can approach scrutinising the bank. I think we would have a more healthy monetary policy debate if MPs were the ones who had to vote through the governor, rather than this situation where a bunch of people in the Treasury go, and it's Andrew Bailey. It would be more healthy if MPs were involved in the process and still had to remember monetary policy exists. But broadly speaking, the things that the government has to do, but particularly about this crisis, are partly about making it easier for the UK to build and invest in different forms of energy. I'm personally highly doubtful, given that UK residents don't get to keep the proceeds of any fracking if it does turn out to exist there, then the politics of fracking will ever line up in the UK. But I think then it's right to have the option to try, although it's very much in the good luck with that category. But modular nuclear, making things easier to build, using cash transfers to deal with the energy price crisis so that people have the benefit of installing heat pumps and other bits onto their homes. These are all really positive things governments can do that do help pull down that inflationary pressure, but it is a real problem, particularly because the UK does have a particular vulnerability to it.
I do think I largely agree with Stephen on this. As in fact, almost most things apparently, apart from interest rates. But there has been too much of a demonisation of gas as a medium-term transition, and the net zero 2050 target has meant that people are like, well, we don't want to build liquid natural gas, and we don't want to allow this, and we're a bit, even a nuclear. The hard green lobby has. It's not just we've not been enough into renewables. We have cut greenhouse gases by 45%, way more than most other countries. A figure that is not bandied about usually in discussions, which drives me up the wall. We are actually doing quite a good job, and other countries could learn in many ways from what we've done to almost halve emissions. But there has been too much of a, oh, well, it's fine because we've got renewables. Renewables are still unstable, even with investment in battery technology, and it may take quite some time. Gas and nuclear are a necessary component of the transition to net zero whenever it happens. And one of the problems is with the 2050 target, and then the moment we achieve that, the green movement moved on to, whether you agree with that target or not, personally I'm like, whether we achieve in 2052, 53, who gives it? Because the last bit is really hard. But the core problem is then that the green movement has moved on to a series of secondary targets that are unrealistic and unachievable, which has meant that a medium-term strategy based around things like gas has basically been ruled out. And that is a real problem. Even if you want to buy net zero by 2050, we are going to have to accept gas as a component because it is a stable source of energy, unlike wind, unlike solar, as part of our medium-term energy strategy.
Okay, let's move on. Gentleman at the back, right in the corner.
Thank you so much. My name is Sal Mathani. I work for an asset manager in the city. And when I look at inflation 5 years from now, markets are telling you that they're pretty well anchored. The problem is the energy crisis. So I guess my question is, what happens if we're in a long war? What is the plan from the right to deal with energy crisis dislocations that last more than 6 months?
Yes, great question. I think going back to, I think it was Stephen said earlier about the problems with the energy price guarantee, which I completely agree. Of course, we should enable people on low incomes who can't afford their bills to pay them through subsidy or whatever that is. But I think it is a mistake not to encourage wealthier people to reduce their demand, because essentially this is a demand problem. There's not enough supply and there's too much demand. And there are plenty of people who could fit solar panels on their roofs, for example, and a battery system. The prices have come right down and become self-sufficient for electricity. And that would reduce demand substantially and would reduce the price for everybody. We should decouple gas and electricity. So I think we've missed a trick because what the government's announced will have no impact whatsoever on demand. And if we're going to have a long war, we need to reduce demand. There are plenty of things we could do in this country to reduce demand. It is difficult to insulate houses, but it's not impossible. There are many, many things we could do. And that's the number one thing we're going to have to do if it's a long war is to reduce demand. So I think that's what we should be looking at. But I agree with Alex, we can't demonise gas. We're going to have to use it. And I do think that there is a problem when how shall I put this? When certain lobby groups have more power than voices in government, for example. And I think Alex is absolutely right. We've got to take the green lobby with a pinch of salt. Of course, we all want to reduce our emissions. We have to be pragmatic. And I don't think we have been so far.
Do you think we should cap the cap? Because I think that, for me, is one of the things the Chancellor should announce on the 23rd of November, that you basically are not going to have an unlimited allowance, as it were, of energy. I think that is a terrible idea, and it will push up interest rates. It is wasteful spending that shouldn't really happen. If you've got a 6-bedroom house, you don't need to turn your underfloor heating on. I'm afraid this winter you're going to have to probably, work out a different way, either buy some electric heaters or get someone in to switch off, your ground floor, because
possibly,
that's mad.
Although I would come, that's an idea. Although I would come back to my earlier argument about household size. I think needs to be taken into account, because if you've got 6 people in your house, you're going to use more energy and need more energy. But I think, the energy cap is an easy catch-all way of administering this, but it's not the fairest, and it won't reduce demand. So I think we need to look at other options. For example, we managed extremely well during the pandemic to get an awful lot of money to an awful lot of people very quickly. We can target those people through digital taxation now, the people who we know are on lower incomes. So I don't see why we shouldn't subsidise gas bills and electricity bills rather than capping the price.
Okay, another question. Let's take the lady here at the front who's been waiting for a while.
Hi, my name's Nadine. I work at Yahoo News. One of the things that struck me so far with the panel is we're talking about the cost of living crisis, but the people struggling most don't earn enough to benefit from these tax cuts or don't work at all because they're disabled. So we're talking about tax cuts here to help with the cost of living. But as we've seen from the government with the budget and the kind of concerns about how they're going to fund it, it's looking like public service cuts, which could jeopardise benefits being uprated with inflation. So I just want to ask you, Miriam, how do you navigate that? If you want tax cuts to help you with the cost of living, but then the consequence is going to have to be benefit cuts, like, do you think it's a trade-off? Like, where's the kind of the line?
Well, firstly, the vast majority of the mini-budget, not budget, that happened last Friday, the vast majority of that spend was on the energy cap, which obviously does help every household. And don't forget, there's an additional £1,200 over the course of the year for the people who are most in need on particular benefits. So there has been, I appreciate that bills, etc., are going up more than that, but there has been an enormous injection of support into the people on the lowest income levels. But you're absolutely right. Tax cuts don't help if the tax threshold is so high that the personal allowance is so high that a lot of people don't pay tax. And this is my point. I think people should start paying tax at a much lower level of income for all sorts of reasons. It makes you invested into society. Why wouldn't you vote for tax rises if you don't pay tax, for example? But I think we should have a lower rate, a 10p rate, let's say, for people on the lowest incomes. And instead of taking money off people and giving it back through benefits, we just take less in the first place. And then when you have tax cuts, everybody would feel the benefit, not just those earning a certain amount of money. Now, I realise that's not going to help right now, but I think uprating the benefits is important. But also, we've got to recognise the size of the package that is going into people on the lowest incomes. Well, people on disability, yes. So the energy packet absolutely does apply to them, but I agree. This is a problem that government has got to find a solution for.
Okay, another question. Gentleman in the second row, in the middle, in the back there. There we are, beard. Ah, yes.
Given the debacle of the last 10 days, is it actually possible for the government to cut any taxes in the short term? And if so, can you think of any that an incoming Labour government would find difficult to reverse?
John, do you want to have a go at that?
Well, the two main tax measures in the mini-budget were cancellations of planned increases, right? They weren't tax cuts per se. A difficult one for Labour to reverse. There's a really good question. Business rates would be top of my list. I think that, well, in fact, Labour have talked about abolishing business rates, which is quite punchy, so they certainly wouldn't reverse it. But I think, you'd be talking... I don't think that Labour would do anything differently on corporation tax. I don't think that they'd increase it as was originally planned. I don't think they'd increase NI as originally planned. So I don't think they'd do all that much different, except for not have done the 45p rate, which has now been reversed anyway. So if you were asking me in a sort of scenario of what would I like to cut that Labour could not therefore put up, I'd go for business rates.
Stephen, you wanted to add something?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think I'm not going to pretend that I think that the last 10 days have been the Conservative Party leadership's finest hours. But I do think that the Conservative Party as a whole does need to take a look at itself here, right? Which is that in the past year, the Conservative Party has said that it did not like the guy who was raising taxes. It spits up its rusk any time a specific cut is named, right? Loads of ministers have been including in this room, been talking about, there's nebulous fat to cut. But the second you actually start to say, put any nouns on this fat, they get angry and, accuse us of talking the UK down or rule it out explicitly. And there does need to be realism within the Conservative Party about what it actually is willing to, what was it actually willing to give up, right? There does have to be something. I think worrying about what Labour can reverse is actually a bit of a blind alley. The Labour Party is obsessed with whether or not things are reversible. Like, they love the idea of, we'll do this and it'll permanently change politics. The nature of democracies is, even when you have a political party whose electoral record is as shall we say, imperfect as the Labour Party is, then it does win occasionally, right? And you just have to accept that things get reversed. But actually, the best way for things not to be reversed is for them to work, right? There's a reason why no one has unpicked John Major's handgun ban. There's a reason why the Labour Party didn't really change the macroeconomic model that it inherited from Ken Clarke and John Major. It worked. Like, the biggest reason why the next Labour government is likely to make changes to how the UK economy works and Conservatives don't like is, look, I'm afraid that it is impossible to look at the macroeconomic record over the last 12 years and conclude that it has been a good one. Yeah, the number one way to do something that Labour doesn't change is to find a better model, whether it's in the next 2 years or the next 7.
I'm going to disagree slightly, because I think that one of the fascinating things is the Labour Party doesn't get them very often, but it is very good at coming up with things that the other side can't reverse, whether you agree with them or not. The Equalities Act being the top of my, where it basically reversed the correct view, in my view, of equality and turned it into a weird sort of indirect version. And like, it was the start of essentially what's becoming the sort of equity revolution, and the forerunner of the terrible word that no one should ever use, but you forced to because there isn't another one, woke. So the Labour Party is, the centre-right, the free marketeers should get better at this. We should get better at coming up with things that the other side can't reverse. I desperately think it's very hard to imagine what the Labour Party couldn't. And for that reason, I would say I think any basic marginal tax rates of over half should go. They are also a supply-side reform. So inflation is caused by an excess supply of money and an undersupply of goods. If you reduce the effective marginal tax rates, you will increase the production of goods. So, for example, if we controversially hold down GP pay and get rid of the £100,000 weird little flip thing, we will probably get more of them working for longer hours, because they will suddenly have slightly lower real incomes unless they increase their hours. There is an issue there, for example, where I'm like, that seems to me to be a win-win, where you basically say, look, we are going to get rid of this strange kink that means it's not worth your while as GPs to work as much, but in return we are going to slightly hold down your pay, and that's going to pay for it.
Okay, John, you just... No. Okay, Miriam, do you want to add anything to that?
I'm less worried about what the Labour Party can reverse and more worried what the media outrage can reverse at the moment.
Right. Okay, all right. Well, we've run out of time, I'm afraid, but that was a fascinating panel discussion. I hope you all agree. When we asked the question, is the worst yet to come, I mean, I'm not leaving this panel feeling terribly positive about the next several months, I have to say, but there we are. Anyway, please thank our panel. Thank you very much, Stephen.